I still remember the day I first saw Claire like it was yesterday. The community college cafeteria was buzzing with activity, but everything seemed to fade into the background when our eyes met. Her smile lit up the room, and I felt my heart skip a beat. We started talking, and I was immediately captivated by her passion for education and her dreams of working with special needs children. I found myself sharing my own aspirations in theatre design, and before I knew it, hours had passed. From that day on, we were inseparable. Every moment we spent together felt magical. So we'd meet up between classes, stealing quick kisses and making plans for the weekend. The half-hour drive between our homes felt like nothing when I knew Claire was waiting the other end. Our weekends were a whirlwind of adventures and quiet moments. We'd explore local parks, try new restaurants, or just curl up on the couch watching movies. I loved the way Claire's eyes crinkled when she laughed, and how she'd absent-mindedly play with my hair while we talked. One night, as we lay under the stars in my backyard, Pat turned to me and said, "I think I'm falling in love with you, David." To my heart soared. I pulled her close and whispered, "I love you too." In that moment, I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. We started talking about our future together. Claire would light up when she described her dream of opening a school for special needs children. So I'd share my visions of designing elaborate sets for Broadway shows. We'd intertwine our dreams, imagining a life where we supported each other's goals and built a home filled with love and laughter. The distance between us only made our time together more precious. Every goodbye was bittersweet, but it made our reunions that much sweeter. I'd count down the days until I could hold her in my arms again, planning little surprises to make each meeting special. I couldn't believe how quickly time had flown since that fateful day in the cafeteria. Claire had become my everything, and I couldn't imagine a life without her. As Valentine's Day 2010 approached, I knew it was time to take the next step. I spent weeks planning the perfect proposal. I wanted it to be special, something that would show Claire just how much she meant to me. On the big day, my hands were shaking as I led her to our favorite spot in the park. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. "Claire," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone." I dropped to one knee, pulling out the ring I'd saved for months to buy. It wasn't much, but it was the best I could afford as a struggling student. "Will you marry me?" The look on her face was everything I'd hoped for. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment I was afraid she might say no. But then she nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. "Yes, David. Yes." She slipped the ring onto her finger, and we kissed. It felt like the beginning of something incredible. But our bubble of happiness was quickly popped by the reality of Claire's family, particularly her mother, Susan. When we broke the news to them, Susan's reaction was exactly what I'd feared. "You can't be serious, Claire," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're throwing your life away for him." The way she said it made it clear what she thought of me. I wasn't good enough for a precious daughter. I never mind that I love Claire with every fiber of my being. Never mind that I was working my ass off to build a future for us. Claire tried to stand up for me, but Susan's words had a way of worming into her head. I could see the doubt flicker in Claire's eyes, and it broke my heart. But I told myself it didn't matter. Our love was stronger than Susan's disapproval. A few months after the proposal, I made the decision to enlist in the US Air Force. It wasn't an easy choice, but I saw it as a way to provide for our future. When I told Claire, she was supportive, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "We'll make it work," I promised her. "Distance can't break what we have." The day I left for basic training was one of the hardest of my life. Claire drove me to the airport, and we spent every possible moment holding each other. As I boarded the plane, I looked back to see her waving, tears streaming down her face. It took every ounce of willpower I had not to run back to her. Basic training was brutal, but thoughts of Claire kept me going. Every free moment I had, I'd write her letters or try to call. Sometimes, though, it felt like I was reaching out into a void. Claire's responses became less frequent, her calls shorter. "I'm just busy with school," she'd say. "You know how it is." I did know. I knew how demanding her program was, especially now that she was in her final year. But something felt off. The Claire I knew would have found a way to make time for me, no matter how busy she was. During a brief break in my training, Claire came to visit. We'd been talking about getting married for a while, and suddenly it felt like the right time. We went to the courthouse, just the two of us, and said our vows. As we exchanged rings, I felt a surge of hope. This was it. We were married. Whatever doubts had been creeping in, Whatever distance had grown between us, surely this would bridge the gap. So we spent that week in a bubble of newly bliss. Every moment we weren't out exploring the town, we were tangled up in each other, making up for lost time. When Claire left, I felt reinvigorated. We could do this. We could make it work. But as the weeks passed, that feeling of distance returned. Claire started working at a summer camp for special needs children, something she'd always dreamed of doing. I was proud of her, excited to hear about her experiences. But those calls became fewer and farther between. Sorry, my phone died, she'd text hours after I'd tried to reach her. I was busy with the kids. You know how it is, she'd say when we finally did talk. I did know. I understood, but that nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Something was wrong, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Christmas came, and with it, a chance for us to be together again. I was ecstatic to see Claire, to hold her in my arms. For a while, it felt like old times. We decorated our small house, exchanged gifts, and spent long nights rediscovering each other. But there were moments when I'd catch her staring off into space, a faraway look in her eyes. When I'd ask what was wrong, she'd smile and say nothing, just thinking about work. As the holiday break came to an end, I felt a growing sense of dread. I didn't want to let her go. I was afraid that if I did, I might lose her for good. The day she left, I held her tight at the airport, not wanting to let go. "I love you," I whispered into her hair. "I love you too," she said, but her voice sounded hollow, distant. As I watched her walk through security, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching my marriage slip away. But I pushed those thoughts aside. We were David and Claire. We could survive anything. The months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Claire's calls became shorter, her texts more infrequent. Every time I reached out, it felt like I was grasping at smoke. "Sorry, I've been swamped with my last semester," she'd say. "You know how it is." I did know. But I also knew that something had changed. The vibrant, loving Claire I'd fallen in love with seemed to be fading away, replaced by someone I barely recognized. Still, I clung to hope. We'd made vows. We'd promised to love each other through thick and thin. This was just a rough patch, I told myself. We'd get through it. We had to. But as spring turned to summer, that hope began to waver. The pit in my stomach grew deeper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. I couldn't believe what was happening. The woman I loved, the one I'd built my entire future around, was standing in front of me like a stranger. Claire's eyes were distant, her words hollow. Every fiber of my being screamed that something was terribly wrong. "What about moving in with me?" I asked, desperately clinging to the plans we'd made. Claire shifted uncomfortably. I have some job interviews back home. I think it's best if I stay there for now." My stomach dropped. This wasn't the reunion I'd imagined. I'd flown back for her graduation, ready to start our life together, but she was slipping away before my eyes. I couldn't take it anymore. The tension, the unspoken truths hanging in the air, it was suffocating me. "Claire, what's really going on? Talk to me." And then it happened. The dam broke. Claire's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, David. I've been seeing someone else." The world stopped. My ears rang. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "What?" I choked out. "It's a camp counselor. We've been for months now." Months. The word echoed in my head. While I'd been working my ass off, dreaming of our future, she'd been, I could not even think of it. "How could you?" I whispered, my voice breaking. Claire just sobbed, offering no explanation, no justification. And in that moment I realized the woman I thought I knew was gone. Future I'd imagined had crumbled to dust. The next 2 months were hell. I couldn't let go. I loved her, or at least I loved who I thought she was. Every fiber of my being screamed to fight for our marriage, to salvage what we had. I called her constantly, pouring my heart out. I sent letters, emails, anything to remind her of what we'd had. But Claire's responses were always the same. Empty apologies, vague promises to work on things. But I could feel the hollowness behind us behind. One night, after a particularly brutal phone call where Claire could barely muster the energy to engage, I found myself sitting on the floor of our empty house. Silence was deafening. Photos of happier times mocked me from the walls. I realized then that I was fighting this battle alone. Claire checked out long ago. She wasn't interested in saving our marriage, and I was destroying myself in the process of trying. With a heavy heart, I made the hardest decision of my life. In August, I filed for divorce. The words felt like ash in my mouth as I spoke to the lawyer. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. So the mandatory 90-day waiting period was torture. Each day dragged on, a reminder of what I'd lost. I rattled around our house, our home feeling like a ghost. The silence was broken only by my own ragged breathing, punctuated by moments where grief overwhelmed me. I thought the pain couldn't get any worse. I was wrong. It was a casual conversation with Claire's cousin that revealed the final crushing blow. Susan, Claire's mother, had been poisoning our marriage from the start. She told Claire you joined the Air Force to get away from her, the cousin said, not realizing the impact of her words, so that you didn't really care about her. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. All those times Susan had looked at me with disdain, all the snide comments, it wasn't just disapproval, it was sabotage. I'd given everything for this marriage. I'd enlisted to provide for our future, endured months of separation, poured my heart and soul into making it work. And all the while Susan had been whispering lies into Claire's ear, twisting my sacrifices into abandonment. The pieces fell into place. Claire's growing distance, her reluctance to communicate. Susan had laid the groundwork for doubt. She'd made it easier for Claire to justify our affair, to see me as the villain. So I wanted to scream. I wanted to confront Susan, to make her face what she'd done. But what good would it do now? The damage was done. My marriage was over, destroyed by lies and betrayal. As I sat in that empty house, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd dreamed of, I felt something inside me harden. The David who had loved so freely, who had trusted so completely, was gone. In his place was someone colder, more guarded. I'd given Claire and her family everything, and they'd repaid me with betrayal and lies. To never again, I vowed. Never again would I let someone have that kind of power over me. So I couldn't take it anymore. The constant anxiety, the sleepless nights, the pit in my stomach that never seemed to go away. It was October, and I felt like I was losing my goddamn mind. Every day was a struggle. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, wondering what new lie Claire or her family had cooked up about me. The isolation was crushing. I was thousands of miles away, surrounded by people but completely alone in my pain. I tried to focus on my duties, but my mind kept circling back to the betrayal. Claire's face, once a source of comfort, now haunted me. The memory of her telling me about the other guy plied and repeat in my head, and that manipulative witch of a mother-in-law, probably gloating about how she'd been right all along. One night, after a particularly brutal anxiety attack, something in me snapped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. The rage and hurt I'd been bottling up for months came pouring out. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type. So I started with Claire's brother. "Hey man, you want to know the truth? Your perfect little sister's been cheating on me for months. Oh, and by the way, we eloped. Bet Mummy Dearest never told you that." I didn't stop there. I texted her sister next, spilling everything. How I'd begged Claire to work on our marriage while she was already checked out. How I'd sacrificed everything for her, only to be tossed aside like garbage. It was messy, it was chaotic, but I couldn't stop. Years of pent-up frustration and pain came flooding out in a torrent of text messages. I knew it was probably a mistake, but in that moment I didn't care. I wanted them to know. I wanted everyone to know what their precious Claire had done. As I hit send on the last message, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. What had I done? But there was no taking it back now. The truth was out there, raw and ugly, for all to see. At the moment I hit send on the last message, I knew there was no going back. But I wasn't done. But not by a long shot. The rage that had been simmering inside me for months finally boiled over, and I found myself consumed by a fierce desire to make Claire and her family face the truth they'd been so eager to bury. I spent the next few hours hunched over my laptop, pouring every excruciating detail of our relationship into a letter. From our secret elopement to her affair, I laid it all bare. No sugarcoating, no holding back. Just the raw, ugly truth that had been eating away at me for so long. As I typed, memories flooded back. The way Claire's eyes had lit up when I proposed, to trembling in her voice as we exchanged vows in that tiny chapel, the gradual coldness that crept into her texts and calls, the gut-wrenching moment when she confessed to her infidelity. Each memory fueled my fingers, driving them across the keyboard with a furious intensity. Once the letter was finished, I didn't even pause to proofread it. I just started searching. Uncles, aunts, cousins, anyone in Claire's family whose address I could track down. I didn't care if I'd never met them or if they barely knew who I was. They were going to know the truth about their precious Claire. With each envelope I addressed, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. Let them see her for who she really was. Let them judge her the way they'd judged me. The next morning, bleary-eyed and running on nothing but adrenaline and coffee, I drove to the post office and mailed out my stack of letters. As I watched the clerk toss them into the outgoing mail bin, a weight lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Days passed and I waited. I knew it wouldn't take long for the shit to hit the fan, and I wasn't disappointed. It started with a barrage of texts from Claire, alternating between rage and desperate pleas. I ignored them all. She'd made a bed, now she could lie in it. Then came the calls from her family members. Some were furious, accusing me of spreading lies, but others were shocked, offering awkward apologies for believing the worst about me. I let most of them go to voicemail. I'd said my piece in those letters. I had nothing left to add. Through the grapevine of mutual friends and acquaintances, I started hearing about the fallout. Claire's devoutly Catholic family had turned on her, horrified by her infidelity and deceit. The perfect image she'd cultivated had shattered, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. But it wasn't just her family. Word had spread to the school where she worked, and the tension became unbearable. Parents whispered and stared, questioning whether someone who could betray their spouse so thoroughly should be trusted with their children. Eventually, Claire was forced to resign, her dream job slipping through her fingers like sand. As I heard about Claire's life crumbling around her, I expected to feel triumphant. This was what I'd wanted. Right, to see her suffer the way I had. But the emotion that washed over me was more complex than simple satisfaction. There was relief. Yes, of finally having the truth out in the open. But there was also a hollow ache, a reminder of the future we'd once dreamed of together, now irreparably shattered. So I threw myself into my work, trying to drown out the conflicting emotions swirling inside me. The anxiety attacks that had plagued me for months began to subside, replaced by a strange sense of calm. I'd done it. I'd taken control of my narrative, refused to be the victim any longer. As weeks turned into months, I had less and less about Claire. The last update I got was from a mutual friend who ran into her at a grocery store. Apparently she looked terrible, gaunt and hollow-eyed, a shadow of her former vibrant self. Well, the guy she'd cheated with was long gone, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions alone. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't muster the emotion. She'd made her choices, just as I'd made mine. We were both living with the results. The divorce was finalized in December, a fittingly cold end to what had once been a warm and loving relationship. As I signed the final papers, I felt a chapter of my life closing. It had been a brutal, painful process, but I'd survived. More than that, I'd come out stronger. I walked out of the courthouse that day with my head held high. The David who had entered this marriage, naive, trusting, willing to bend over backwards to make someone else happy, was gone. In his place stood someone harder, more cynical perhaps, but also more self-assured. Someone who knew his own worth and wouldn't let anyone make him doubt it again. As I drove home, the winter sun weak but bright in the rearview mirror, I allowed myself a small smile. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to seeing where it might lead. So I stood in the empty apartment surrounded by cardboard boxes and the echoes of a life I'd once shared with Claire. The divorce papers lay on the kitchen counter, signed and ready to be filed. A weight lifted off my shoulders as Ali sealed the last box, knowing this was truly the end. My phone buzzed. Claire's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated for a moment before silencing it and shoving it back in my pocket. No more second chances, no more explanations. She'd made a choice, and now I was making mine. Loading up my car felt cathartic. Each box represented a piece of our shared past I was leaving behind. As I drove away from the apartment complex, I caught a glimpse of Claire's car pulling in. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, but I kept driving. There was nothing left to say. The next few weeks were a blur of settling into my new place and throwing myself into work. My colleagues noticed the change in me. Gone was the lovesick puppy, replaced by a man with steel in his spine and ice in his veins. So I'd learned my lesson about wearing my heart on my sleeve. Claire tried reaching out a few times. Voicemails, text messages, even a letter. Each one went open and had unread. I couldn't risk letting her words worm their way back into my heart. The wound was still too fresh, the betrayal too raw. One Saturday morning, I ran into Susan at the local grocery store. Her eyes widened when she saw me, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she composed herself. David, I cut her off with a raised hand. Save it, Susan. I don't want to hear anything you have to say. She persisted, her voice taking on that sickly sweet tone I'd grown to despise. I just think if you'd give Claire another chance. Another chance? I laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. To what? Lie to me again? Cheat on me again? No thanks. I'm done being your family's punching bag. I left her standing there, mouth agape as I walked away. It felt good to finally stand up to her, to not let her manipulative words affect me anymore. Months passed and slowly I started to feel like myself again. The anger that had been my constant companion began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace. I'd survived the worst betrayal of my life and come out stronger for it. I focused on my career, throwing myself into new projects and challenges. The promotion I'd been eyeing for months finally came through, a testament to my hard work and dedication. As I celebrated with my colleagues, I realized I was genuinely happy for the first time in a long while. Dating was different now. I approached relationships with caution, always keeping a part of myself guarded. Some women found it frustrating, but I couldn't bring myself to be as open and vulnerable as I once was. The risk of getting hurt again was too great. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I ran into Claire. She looked different, older, somehow. The vibrant girl I'd fallen in love with seemed diminished, weighed down by regret and consequences. David, she said softly, her eyes pleading. Can we talk? Please. But I regarded her coolly, feeling none of the love or warmth I once had. I think we've said all there is to say, Claire. I'm sorry, she blurted out. For everything. I know I hurt you and I. Stop, I interrupted, holding up a hand. Your apology doesn't change anything. What's done is done. I've moved on, and I suggest you do the same. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing. No urge to comfort her, no desire to make things right. I simply nodded a goodbye and walked away, leaving her and our shared past behind me. But as I drove home that night, I realized that encounter was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. But I felt no joy, no sadness, just acceptance. Claire was now just another person from my past, no longer holding any power over my emotions or my future.